think we're all, I think we're all good to go. Sound tracking okay at the back there? Fantastic, thank you very much. So yeah, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming along to my talk today. My name's Diana. I'm a narrative designer at Splash Damage based in London. And today I'm going to be talking to you about storytelling in live games, specifically through the lens of a project I released last year, which was the finale to RuneScape 3's 2021 to 2022 season of content, this quest called Extinction. This was a major project for me, and obviously I learned a huge amount making it, and I'll be sharing 4 of those lessons with you here today. I hope this talk will be useful to quest designers, narrative designers, people who want to learn more about the fairly unique storytelling challenges you get when building big stories in titles that are continually updating. So this is what I've got coming up over the next 40 minutes or so. We will have time for questions at the end, so please hold on to them until then if you can. I will start by introducing myself a little bit, and then I will do some exposition and tell you a bit more about Extinction. Where did it come from? What did it need to do? And why did it end up happening? Like, why was a game like RuneScape trying to tell a story of this scale in the first place? I'll cover a quick retrospective about it, including the good, the bad, and the ugly parts of its release. And then I'll go into the 4 key takeaways of this talk, which is how to tackle endings in never-ending games, how to get players to care about big stakes, the importance of scoping out the practical consequences of your story, and I will finish by touching on surviving hostile player reception. But first off, hello. As I said on the first slide, I am a narrative designer at Splash Damage, working on their brand new AAA sci-fi IP Project Astrids. I started at Frontier Developments in QA on the Elite franchise, and then moved to Jagex to specialize in general development, and from there I specialized in narrative and quest design. Along the way, I've done various mentorship schemes, such as Into Games, Limit Break, and work with the writing collective Tailspinners. I know Into Games are here today, so thank you very much, you guys. So yeah, I'm a narrative developer with a grounding in QA and generalist design, and I've only ever worked on live games. I will be using the term live games to describe the games as a service model of continually updating titles, usually online, usually multiplayer, but I do think the principles I'm going to be discussing today are relevant to any game that's not purely a boxed product. So if you're adding DLCs onto a main release, or if you've released an indie title and the community is growing and you want to add on more stuff for them to enjoy, I do think the things I'm going to be discussing today will be relevant to you. Before I get into the meat of things, I do need to give a couple of disclaimers. I am here in a personal capacity. I am not representing any employer of mine, past or present. These opinions are solely my own and things I've learned over the course of my career. And obviously, this talk contains major spoilers for recent story content in RuneScape 3. So let's start with a bit of exposition. Throughout 2021 and into early 2022, RuneScape 3 put on its first ever formal season of content. And if you've not come across it before, RuneScape is this high fantasy MMO-RPG. It's been running continuously since 2001. It grew directly out of the graphical muds and point-and-click adventure games of the late 90s, and it still has that spirit in it to this day. It now exists in 2 forms. We have old school RuneScape, which has a heavier focus on XP grinding and nostalgia, and then RuneScape 3, which is the one I worked on, and it's a more contemporary spin on the world. Before the Elder God Wars, story in RuneScape 3 was told in a very ad hoc way. So quest lines and characters were added when they were needed, but there was very little in the way of overarching, unifying story. Different parts of the world were developed at different times and different rates, and this resulted in a very charming patchwork of tones and styles and story focuses. The Elder God Wars was a radically different approach. For a whole year, with roughly 1 major edition each month, so 12 updates back to back, all new content was part of one storyline. So we had new bosses, new skilling methods, new quests, a whole new city. Everything was in service to this one storyline. And this storyline was some very high fantasy stuff, so bear with me. The Elder Gods are awake. These are the creatures that made the universe, and now they want to complete their life cycle, hatch their eggs, and if we let that happen, the babies will eat the universe and remake it anew. So yeah, extremely high fantasy stakes here. In its most condensed form, this was, we need to stop the elders from touching their eggs, or else everything will die. And I want you to think about the scale of those stakes for a moment, and then remember it for a point I'm going to elaborate on shortly. Put simply, this was about the end of the world. So we had a whole year's worth of content, everything building towards one question of, will you be able to save the universe? And Extinction was the final beat of this storyline. It was where this huge question of, will you be able to save the world, would finally be answered. I joined Jagex at the start of the Elder God Wars and contributed a few parts to it in the time it was running, but this was a way bigger project. The world was ending, and somehow our players had to avert it. It's classed as a grandmaster quest within the internal quest classification Jagex has. And there are only about 6 or 7 of those quests in-game out of about 250 in total. So these are the longest and most complicated pieces of story content that RuneScape has to offer. And Extinction was actually the first Grandmaster quest since 2016, so this was big. And accordingly, the team involved was large. We had 4 content developers, including myself, on at the start, and then various other developers swapped on and off throughout the dev process. We had 5 months from kickoff to release, and for a RuneScape project, that's a big team and a lot of time. And for me, it was even more significant because I was a junior developer at the time, but this was my first project as a feature lead. I was leading this project. So yeah, very cool, very exciting, and very, very scary at the same time. On a practical level, there were 2 key things that Extinction needed to do for the game. And primarily, it needed to resolve the threat of the Elder Gods. This is a threat that had hung over the game since that last Grandmaster quest in 2016. That was the first time players had been asked, will you be able to save the world? And by 2021, it was starting to get in the way. We needed to finish it. We needed to finish that story for good. No hanging threads, no further explanation. It had to be done. The second priority was more forward-facing. Extinction had to start the difficult process of dialing down the stakes of the game. Remember that the Elder God Wars was about the end of the universe. You cannot get bigger than that. Where does a live game go next after they face this threat? And this was a difficult problem for RuneScape because it had previously followed the fairly stereotypical progression of an RPG. You start by baking a cake, and then you move on to slaying dragons, and then you have more and more adventures until you're helping the god of chaos heist an artifact of creation, and so on and so on. And then eventually, you are face to face with one of the elder gods, with Jas herself. And she is challenging you to prove that mortal life is worth existing. Will you be able to save the world? Basically, the threats that players had been facing had got bigger and bigger over the years, and the stakes were creeping up to a totally unsustainable level for a live game. Remember, this is a title that has to keep updating. We cannot end the story after we face the biggest threat. We always have to think about what happened next. So Extinction had to change the meta, as it were. It had to be the first beat of a concerted effort to return the stakes to a more sustainable and grounded level. So all of that is to say this was a big project. It was the final beat of a long, in-depth, high-stakes story. It had to do some very important narrative jobs. And we had asked players if they were capable of winning against the creators of the universe, and now we had to pay it off. I won't go into the fine details of what happened in the quest itself because I would be here all day if I tried, but I will do a quick retrospective now. I will say that quite a few things went very well. The 2 main priorities of the Elder God storyline were achieved with great success. We had multiple god-tier objects and beings removed from play, one way or the other, so helping scale down the stakes. And the actual problem of the Elder Gods was properly resolved. Brilliant, fantastic. From a development point of view, we released with only a slight delay, which I was very, very pleased with, and we had no major bugs on release day. Brilliant. We have one member of our QA team in the audience today who did a fantastic job on it. So yeah, from that perspective, it was a really smooth release day. We had a lot of positive feedback on a whole range of things as well. So there was a lot to be happy about. But as with any release, there was plenty of fair criticism too. And I will say that I agree with all this feedback on this slide. If I had a second shot at this project, this is stuff I would address. Given the scale of the story and the size of that question that players had to answer, and the lack of scope for really any branching paths, players actually had very little agency over the outcome of the quest. They noticed it, they didn't like it. Fair enough. Another point of feedback I had was that it was a bleak ending for a season finale. The final result was survival, not triumphant victory, and that did not sit well with some players. And then from a more technical narrative point of view, some characters didn't have enough action to really justify their presence, and some parts of the pacing could have been improved on. The most significant, loudest negative feedback, though, focused on the initial set of rewards, which were nowhere near enough to compensate for the effort of the quest. And the events of the quest didn't feel like they had that much of an impact on the rest of the game world. This really stuck with players, and it resulted in the aftermath of this release absolutely sucked. I was quite personally invested in this project. It was big for me. I'd put a lot of myself into it. And seeing what felt like a significant proportion of the player base kind of banding together to trash it was really tough. The hype in the community investment in this was high, as you can probably tell by what I've described earlier. It was the final beat of this first ever long-term season, a whole year of content leading up to this moment. So it was highly anticipated. And this was a double-edged sword because thousands of highly invested players each had their own ideas of how the storyline could end. And when we didn't meet that, our community sentiment plummeted from one of its highest levels ever pre-release to one of its lowest levels ever post-release. And to me, it really felt like every single social was on fire, and it was my fault. I'm a little bit ashamed to admit this, but I feel like it is so important to talk about this side of development because I very rarely see it talked about. Yes, this caused me to burn out quite significantly, and yes, this caused me to leave the company. To be clear, I cannot fault Jagex's response. I want to make that very, very clear. They offered a huge amount of help and support, a really exceptional level, and prevented me from leaving the industry altogether. But in the end, I did decide to move on to a role that didn't involve such a close interface with player communities. So what is there to learn from this experience? What are the 4 key takeaways that I want to highlight today? Firstly, the endings in never-ending games need some special consideration. You need to think of them in a slightly different way compared to endings in a standalone story. Secondly, if you want players to care about a story with big stakes, you need to make it personal somehow. And I'll cover a strategy I used for doing that in that point. Thirdly, you should always scope out the practical consequences of your stories. And finally, I will touch on community dogpiles, how to survive them, and how to learn and grow from them. So let's talk about story endings and live games. Live games have a couple of key characteristics that can make storytelling a challenge. And firstly, and most obviously, they don't end. And trying to generalize anything about storytelling is a recipe for someone trying to tell me off, but I think it's fair to say that in traditional storytelling, at least, the ending is the point of the story. It's that moment of catharsis. It's the lesson learned when you see the heroic change in the protagonist or the lack of change in the victim of a tragedy. Those are the moments that your players want to experience. In a boxed game, you can build the entire story around that dramatic climax and then be content with your player putting down the game and moving on satisfied. Live games don't support that approach. They are perpetual products. They are continually updating and iterating on themselves. This comparison was made in a talk about narrative design in mobile games yesterday, so I'm not the first person to come up with this analogy. If you want to compare a boxed game to a film, then live games are comparable to long-running TV shows or soap operas. It's not a one-to-one analogy, but it's a nice illustration of the difference in storytelling style you need to bear in mind. So the end of your story will not be the end of the game. Players will return to that world to experience what happens next. So you need to deliver on that and bear in mind that they expect consequences. The second key characteristic is where players will be spending most of their time. Players who enjoy live games, like myself, will be sinking hundreds of hours into mastering them, but most of those hours will not be spent in story content, which is usually, in some games it is repeatable, but usually that is one-time experience. So most of their game time is spent in the world rather than in the story. It's very common for highly experienced players to only engage in story to help them optimize their regular gameplay, and you have to bear that in mind. It means that to most players, the state of the ongoing world is more impactful on a day-to-day basis than any event in any one quest. So when you put these two characteristics together, you get a conclusion that players will be spending most of their time in a world with a gradually evolving status quo, occasionally breaking out of their usual gameplay patterns to engage in story, and then returning to the world. So a big part of live game storytelling is considering the what happens next. What impact is this going to have? How is it going to change the world? You really have to consider what the story and its ending will tangibly mean for the world. I've boiled this down to a very rough rule of thumb. For a title that is continually adding more story, the scale of the drama in any one story should be proportional to the tangible impact it has on the rest of the game. So if you're telling a small story, a bottle quest, a little cute comedy skit, then players would probably expect those to have minimal impact, and that's fine. But if you want to do a big story, if you want that huge dramatic climax, then you'd better be prepared to go into the main world and really shake things up. If a player invests a couple of hours in a long and complex story, and then they return to the main world and nothing's changed, that's such a huge anticlimax. It's immediately going to put a sour taste in their mouth. What's the point of their story investment if it's not going to impact the rest of their gameplay? So you need to budget for this. When you're developing a high-stakes story, you need to make sure you budget for creating a proportional impact on the rest of the game world. And this was Extinction's biggest weakness. As a team, we were so focused on getting the gameplay of the quest itself done that I classed post-quest impacts as lower priority or out of scope, and this was a mistake. I should have set aside time to make sure the events we were showing were properly reflected in the main game world, in things like post-quest dialogue, which I know is absolutely beloved by RuneScape quest fans. Bringing characters like this war council in the main world up to date should have been removed. It wasn't. That's a mistake. Basically making players feel like they'd done something with a permanent impact. We had asked them if they were capable of saving the world. When they'd shown us by completing the quest that the answer was yes, they deserved a significant impact on the world to properly reflect the scale of that drama. And one aspect of this was the quest rewards. Our initial offering, a new skilling area, was really what sparked the community outrage because it wasn't enough. It all came from the same feeling of this isn't worth the effort of the quest. Basically, the tangible impact of Extinction wasn't enough to justify the kind of story it was. It was a huge end-of-the-world story. Finishing it should have created a pretty big impact on the world. And I'm going to come back to this point in a second. We did fix these issues in the post-release period, but it's something I should have factored into main development. So when you're considering story endings in live games, you should really think about what can you change in the world? What's in your toolbox? Do you have the ability to deliver a seismic change to the game's world? If yes, then maybe a big and world-changing story is actually on the cards. But if such a thing is way out of scope, and you kind of know it's out of scope, then you really should reconsider the stakes of your story. On to my second point. Why should players care about the end of the world? This is something that's true in many types of fiction, and I think it's particularly important in titles that don't have a specified endpoint. End-of-the-world stakes in a game that isn't being actively and openly sundowned are completely meaningless. Players know that the world isn't going to end because they're playing a live game. By definition, they know it's going to keep going. So there's no drama inherent in asking, oh, will we be able to avert the end of the world? Because yes, of course you will. I don't think there are any games out there that are willing to account for the lose condition there, apart from maybe some small indie titles. So there's no threat in the existential question itself. And threat is everything. Threat is drama. So how do we create meaningful threat in this situation? My strategy for sorting this out is making it personal. You might not be able to influence the higher level points of the story. Maybe you were just given story beats and you have to make them work. But one way to help such a story actually mean something is add elements that make it personal to the player. A note to the player, not the player's avatar. Because in many live games, the player avatar is a blank slate. Any backstory or history they have is created by the player and then projected into the world. There's nothing canon about it. But you can make it personal to the player themselves, especially if they're an engaged story player. because they will have formed opinions and proxy relationships with characters and locations and things in the game, exactly the same as they would with a book or a film or a TV show. So leverage that, use that connection to introduce meaningful drama when the world is ending, when we all know it actually isn't. And RuneScape 3 has done this before on many occasions. My favorite example is this quest, Lord of Vampirium. It's the penultimate quest in its storyline. You have gathered a gang of allies over the course of 5 or 6 quests beforehand, and now you're infiltrating the lair of a vampire king to kill him. And everything goes wrong. Everything that could possibly go wrong does go wrong. You end up racing up a tower, hunted down by the boss, and your allies are picked off one by one in each encounter. And it's so tense. It is gloriously dramatic because the threat feels real. Your allies, your friends are being killed one by one, and they don't come back. The threat is meaningful, and it feels personal. And Extinction initially didn't have any of this feeling. The core threat was, will we be able to avert the end of the world? And of course, that's a foregone conclusion. Of course, we're going to be able to avert it. So I had to include more personal aspects to get players to care. I'm going to quickly talk you through how I used 3 different groups of NPCs to do this. This is possibly my favorite method of introducing personal drama because I love doing character writing, so this is my first port of call. And I recognized that I was very lucky with RuneScape because it is a large game. It has a huge established cast of NPCs that story players are very attached to. So there's a lot of room to maneuver in this area. I recognize that might not work for every game, but this is what worked for me on this particular project. Firstly, and most importantly, was the challenge of making the core question of the quest mean anything. Will we be able to save the world in the context of a game like RuneScape is no threat. So I needed to translate it into something with a less certain answer so that players would be drawn into the quest and attempt to answer it because they don't know where it's going to go. And luckily, we had the perfect character for this. This is Seren. And I'm not exaggerating when I say she carries this quest because she has a personal, familial connection to the Elder God. She is the bridge between the player and this huge, meaningless threat. She views them as family, and yet she is nominally on the player's side throughout the rest of the season. She has been this protagonist, this ally for the rest of the season, and one major plot point of Extinction was her flip, which has been seeded and built on for a few story installments beforehand. So she has this inherent conflict. Will she choose to save her family or will she side with the player? And that question is instantly far more dramatic and meaningful because players have opinions about Seren. She is a major recurring character that players can actually interact with in the world. Changing the focus of the drama, oh, I've lost my cursor. So yeah, changing the focus of the drama from the end of the world to this very personal choice by an NPC that players know well makes the threat mean something. And spoiler alert, I said it was a bleak ending. Seren ended up choosing her family. So that was the overall core of the quest taken care of. What about subplots? This was a grandmaster quest, after all. It needed to have depth and several things going on in order to feel big. And one of those subplots was centered around the second priority of Extinction, which was dialing down the stakes. Goodness, here we go. I needed to remove several overpowered objects and characters to prevent them from derailing future stories. And top of my list was this thing, the Needle, which is effectively a time machine. And anyone who's worked with me knows I hate time travel in fiction, and this is why. Removing or just breaking the Needle is quite a dispassionate requirement in and of itself. So to introduce drama and to make it mean something, I, again, used an NPC to bring it more effectively into the world. Wrong one. And I did that via this NPC, Carapac. He is another major recurring character. A lot of players are very attached to him. He's kind of this tragic anti-hero, a bit edgy, a bit angsty. One of my favorite characters in game, actually a standalone boss in the Elder God Wars dungeon. And he's also the avatar of the Needle. So yeah, there's a brilliant connection there. I could end the Needle's story by ending Carapac's story. And this ended up turning into one of the high points of the quest. Carapac got what he wanted. He went out in this blaze of righteous fury. And players loved this conclusion to the story. This was probably, again, a high point of the quest. And it made the context of it, made the removal of the needle from the world make sense. And the third example I'll quickly cover relates to a more forward-facing subplot. The end of Extinction wasn't going to be the end of the game, obviously, so I had to include a hook to set up the next thing. If live games are comparable to a TV show, then this is the end of season cliffhanger, the thing that gets players gossiping about until they reach the next premiere. And I did that by introducing two new characters, Moya and Adrastea. They had quite minor parts. Remember I said that some of the criticism focused on NPCs not having enough to do. That was about these two. And I think that's fair enough criticism. A second shot of it, I would have given them more to do. But it was important to me to include them because they were new characters and I knew they were going to become faction leaders in the next season. So players needed to build a connection to them. They needed to build that relationship with them in order for future drama to mean something. And yes, spoiler alert, these two ended up being major faction leaders and they're fairly popular characters now, which I'm very happy about. So yeah, using NPCs to make big stakes meaningful is one strategy of making drama matter if you're working with a mature live game with a large cast of NPCs. Leverage previous player connections to generate personal drama in such a high-stakes situation. I feel so strongly about my next point that I've put it on its own slide. No matter what kind of story you are trying to tell in a live game, scope out the practical consequences of this. I want everyone on a dev team to drill this principle into their heads. What does it mean? It means evaluating on a practical level whether your game can effectively tell the story that you want to tell. It means refusing to rely on the idea of we'll work it out later. And it means actively pushing back on this insidious idea of developer magic. This idea of you're devs, you'll work it out. No. What is dev magic? It's crunch. It's stress and crunch. It's nothing more than that. And I think everyone in the room will understand that you cannot make good creative decisions when you are crunching. You're just trying to survive at that point. Not all games can tell all stories, and that's fine. If your story, the consequences of your story imply a change in your game that's out of scope, maybe you should change the stakes. That's a fine conclusion to reach. Yeah, and sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. Oh yeah, and yeah, this was something that Extinction fell afoul of because it was the result of many cycles of we'll work it out later that started long before I joined the company. And eventually later's going to arrive. Eventually you're going to have to deal with it. And when later did arrive for this particular story, RuneScape really struggled from a technical and artistic and a development point of view to properly answer the question that had been asked. And that might sound like a spicy conclusion to reach, but it's kind of objective, and I am not dunking on the people who came up with the idea or the creative team who proposed the Elder God Wars and the Elder God threat in the first place. It's just something that I really need people to bear in mind when they are proposing these stories. What is it going to look like to the player? What is the conclusion actually going to mean in-game? And can you then deliver that? Like I said, yeah, not all games can tell all stories, and that is fine. It's the joy of narrative design. You can tell any story at any level of stakes. You don't have to go bigger and bigger and bigger in order to tell good stuff. My final takeaway from this talk is about dealing with and learning from community dogpiles. It is horrible when this happens, and for aspiring devs in the audience, this will probably happen to you at least once in your career. So work on building the toolkit and the tools and the resilience to cope with it when it does happen so that you can become a stronger and better dev for it. And I will say a small disclaimer here that it's a bit of an unusual situation because Jagex developers can choose to have a very direct connection with players. A lot of us are personally active on Twitter and Reddit, and we're talking to players on a day-to-day basis, which is so much fun when things are going well. But when things go bad, it can make everything feel far more personal than it actually is. So yeah, these are some things that helped me out when I was in this situation. Step one is disengaging. Get out of the firing line. If you're working on a live game, you will probably have community managers. Use them. They are very good at their jobs. They will be able to sift through the piles of people yelling and giving negative feedback, to find the useful things that you can actually change and try and address that feedback. And it's so important to cut yourself slack in this situation. When it feels like the whole community hates something you've made, it can kind of feel like that. But it's often not true. Players don't know about the behind-the-scenes stuff. They don't see behind the curtain. They don't know about the sacrifices and the different priorities you had to have when developing this thing. So show yourself a bit of kindness and bear that in mind. They don't know the full picture, and you do. So, be kind to yourself. Obviously, take breaks, use your holiday. Why do devs not use their holiday? Please use your holiday. It's your legal right. Don't be exploited by not taking it. Trying not to let things get too personal is a complicated one. And I know this is particularly true for writers and narrative developers, because we often are very personally invested in our work. We put a lot of ourselves into our stories, and that can turn reasonable but negative feedback into a personal attack. So I do highly recommend cultivating this professional distance between yourself and your work. It's something I'm still working on. I think it's something most devs work on for most of their career, but please do bear that in mind. It'll make these scenarios much easier to handle. It's also worth remembering that the negative opinions will shout the loudest. The players who liked it or thought, oh, that was all right, will just get on with their days. They won't go on Reddit and tell you how bad it was. So the positive stuff or even the neutral stuff you probably won't see, but it is out there. And most importantly for me was waiting to see what the long-term view turned out to be. For Extinction, once the initial dogpile was over, once that kind of frenzy of negative feedback ended, 3 months later, 6 months later, a year later, there was a lot of really positive feedback. A lot of people saying, wow, this was really good. I really enjoyed this. But because they weren't active in the first couple of weeks when everything was, to me, on fire, I didn't see it. So yeah, the long-term view may be very different to the short-term one. And I think the TLDR of this slide is, it's just a game. It can feel horrible when people are dunking on your creative work, but keeping this stuff in mind, keeping that perspective, disengaging, cutting yourself some slack can really help you manage this kind of situation. Pick up on the positive feedback, pick up on the negative feedback, learn and grow from it. So it is past. I will now move into my conclusion slides. Basically, in conclusion, live game storytelling involves some unique considerations. Your stories must fit into and have a proportional impact on a wider, never-ending world, which is where players will be spending most of their time. Given this, make sure you consider the consequences of your stories on a narrative level and on a technical level. Can the stories you want to tell be effectively told by your tech and your team practices? Here's a little checklist of useful questions to ask when thinking about developing stories in live games. What is the conclusion to this story going to look like? What will it be to players? What actions will they be doing? What set pieces will they be experiencing? Can you effectively deliver that? And if you have any doubts here, stop and reconsidering the story your ending is leading to. What impact is it going to have on the main game world? Is that impact enough? Is it proportional to the drama that's just been experienced? And if it is, do you have the budget for that? And if you don't have the budget, if that impact isn't proportional, what do you need to change? Bringing down the stakes is a valid solution here, and one I think that game developers should embrace more often. If you must tell a story with huge stakes, make sure it has some personal elements to the players so that they care about what's going on. And if players don't like it, it sucks, but it's only a game, right? It's not actually the end of the world. It can feel like it, but it's really not. Some credits and thank yous before I finish up. Obviously, a huge thank you to the entire team behind Extinction. There was a lot of people involved. It was a challenging project made under difficult circumstances. And despite all the criticism, I do feel like I've been quite negative in this talk. I am so proud of what we made. I love it. I think it's a really cool project, and I am so, so proud of it. Special shout outs go to Steve Rowley, my manager at the time, who provided a really exceptional level of support during the project and in the difficult post-release period. James Crowther, who I have the pleasure of working with at Splash now, who gave me a lot of mentorship, co-wrote key sections of the quest, and helped me out when it came to making big quests. And to Tim Fletcher, our lead designer on RuneScape 3, who really helped us rip off the Band-Aid and face the story and deliver it as good as we could, given the circumstances. He taught me a lot through this project, a lot of stuff I'm going to carry with me throughout the rest of my career. So yeah, he deserves a lot of credit here. Final slide. Here are my socials. Drop me a follow. I am regrettably still on Twitter. I don't like it, but I'm still there. If you are going to ask me about getting into game narrative, I will direct you to my resources page, which has a bunch of really good stuff that other people have made that I've found useful over the years, including videos, mentorship schemes, websites, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, if you want to connect and talk game story, I'm here. With that, thank you so very much for listening, and I will now open the floor for questions. How do we do questions? You got a microphone? Lovely.
Hey, I just want to say thanks for that. I think it was really interesting to see a post-mortem as a presentation, like the good, the bad, and the ugly. That was really good to see, like going through it all and your thought process behind it all. In reflection, is there anything you would have done differently or added into your workflow, or a feedback gate at some point and gone, this might be a problem here? Can I get a second pair of eyes on it? Like, how does that work for you?
So in terms of what I would do differently from a pipeline point of view, is that your question there? Yeah. Biggest thing I would change is not trying to write the script first. Because there was a lot of really important story beats that had to be hit in this particular quest, a lot of kind of, right, this narrative thing has to hit, this character has to do this. I ended up writing the script and the dialogue and like the stage directions as my first job, and that made unifying it with the gameplay very difficult, especially once we hit localization lock and code lock, and we had to really limit what we could change. So in terms of a second time around, it's gameplay first. Sketch out the story beats, get the gameplay done, and then write the script. That would be the biggest change I would make.
Hi, thank you very much. That was a really interesting look at the experience. You spoke, when you were talking about endings, you spoke a bit about not being afraid to shake up the world to make sure that the impact matches. With a live game, how do you see that happening without risking affecting new players coming in who haven't experienced the rest of the game before that change, and also making sure the content doesn't get, or previous content doesn't get?
That's a really, really good point, and something you always have to bear in mind with live games, because it is a world rather than like a single point. The multiplayer aspect can create some huge problems from that point of view. To me, it would be about talking to other developers. What are they working on? Where's your first-time user experience team looking at, and trying to integrate it all? There is no one answer there. But yes, you're right. It's definitely something you should bear in mind in terms of what can you actually change. Like, if I think one nice example would be if you are saying, oh yeah, we're going to destroy this landmass in game, you would have to go through to go, how is this going to affect players at different levels? How is this going to affect the first-time user experience? And sometimes you might say, yeah, actually, this is a cool idea. We can shake up the meta. We can do something really fun here. Or it might be a case of, no, that doesn't fit. We need to go back to the drawing board. But yes, definitely something to bear in mind.
Hi, great talk. You talk about budgets with big bads. How do you get over the fact that every season there's a big bad, big bad, big bad, and then you got the next one, next one, next one? Is it like a tempo change that you have to implement? You worried about like just exhausting players?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part of that? I didn't quite catch.
Exhausting players, like going through all these kind of big stakes.
Yeah, I know. Myself as a story player, I hate stake creep. Like, it's a big bad. Oh wait, it's another big bad. Oh wait, I hate that. I think it's so like unimaginative, right? It's introducing variety. Like, you can have big bads. You can have like, oh, there's a huge mortal threat to you. That's great, but in moderation. You want to intersperse it with smaller threats that are still personally meaningful, such as I need to help a friend out with this kind of thing, or the classic version in RuneScape is Small Favor, which is just a series of change fetch quests. And it's still vaguely dramatic, but it's so like low stakes. You've got to mix it up, pepper it up. Don't have like, oh, things are awful, and then, oh, things are awful, and then, oh, things are awful. Because, yeah, players get sick of that, right?
Thanks for the talk. You mentioned you started as QA for, and then not branched off into sort of narrative writing.
Yeah.
Do you, in your job description, do you have to require to do any kind of like coding or learn to code or program?
Yes.
Or you do?
Yes, so for content developers at Jagex, they are generalist game designers, and I assume you're asking about what you need to do for the job. It is about scripting and coding. And so I was scripting in both senses of the word. I was writing the dialogue script, and I was scripting gameplay in engine, in the coding language. So yes, both skill sets there for this particular job.
Thank you.
One at the back there.
Thanks for the talk. I'm just interested because you've been talking about like trying to do stakes in the game where you're trying to set like a big bad or a huge event, and how it being a live service, that's kind of, you know, they kind of clash almost because, you know, it's always going to go on. I'm just wondering if you have an example, if you think a game that's handled that well, where it's set something up big and it's kind of stuck the landing, even though you know it's ongoing. I realize that's a very tough question, but
very good question. Off the top of my head, maybe Warframe have done it a couple of times. Warframe's narrative is really good. I love Warframe. I have seen Destiny attempt it recently, and I don't think they stuck the landing for the same kind of reasons, going too big. RuneScape tried, and we kind of had a middling success with it. World of Warcraft, buy me a drink first, then I'll tell you about World of Warcraft. It is very, very difficult, though. Very few games can pull it off well. Yeah, top of my head, Warframe has done it best.
cheers, thanks.
Thank you.
Hiya, thank you very
Hello.
much. Very good talk. Yeah, there seemed to be a significant shift, at least at Jagex, for presenting the player rather as they were a supporting character in the story to becoming a major protagonist when they made them the World Guardian. Did you find that presented significant challenges when developing this quest and other content that you worked on at Jagex?
So that is a very good point to raise, and I probably should have said it in the presentation. One of the things that Extinction had to do as part of that stake dialing down was make the player more of an active participant in the story, because the other NPCs and the other characters had got so big and so powerful that the player was just kind of standing on the sidelines, like watching these gods do their plans, and that's not good gameplay, that's not fun. But now, like if you go and play in game now, like you are having more of a tangible impact on the world around you, which is way better, in my opinion. Extinction did struggle with this. There was a lot of railroading. There was a lot of stuff had to happen regardless of what the player did, and that was just a weakness of the story. I don't think there was much I could have actually done about that, apart from maybe adding some more sandbox gameplay in the lower stakes elements. But there was so much, like I said, about the writing the script. So many beats had to happen in a certain way to make things pay off properly and make things work, that yes, the player was a bit of a bystander, and yes, that was just a weakness of the story, of the quest.
Awesome, thank you.
All right. I think this is the last question we have time for.
Hi. So first of all, thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
I really admire how honest you were about everything. I know it takes guts to stand up there and admit, what you could have done better. So absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Done. My question is, how much scope did you have to kind of change things before launch? Like, did you pick up on any of these things that you now have retroactively noticed, right? Like, did you notice any of those before launch, like see any of the dangers? And if so, what scope did you have to change it? And did you change anything? This ties into what I said about cutting yourself some slack, because
yes, there were some aspects of that we noticed before release. But real life happens. I got evicted 2 weeks before this project went out. I was house hunting rather than, trying to end up not homeless, rather than working on some of those things. And that's kind of what I mean by real life happens, stuff gets in the way. There's stuff, yeah, we probably could have caught, but because they weren't game breaking, they weren't like absolute highest priority, I decided to prioritize myself and to not end up homeless, right? So yes, I wish I'd had time and scope to change it before release, but the universe fucked me over. So, and it's now course 2, so I think that is all we have time for. Thanks very much.